help me. Thank you to those that I can see now. And I'm just going to start with a little bit of business. We have, let's see, sorry, I just got out of class. I'm in the wrong page. Oh my God. And my computer is giving me a hard time. Let's try this. All right, so things coming up. Everyone, I think, is aware that the reflections are coming up next week. I have received some emails with questions, concerns. So if you have anything that you need to talk to me about regarding those, you can stick around after class or shoot me an email. The place to submit them has been moved to next week on the course page. So you'll see it under week 8. Put your 1 through 5 reflections there. And then just to kind of also point your attention to what's coming up next week in terms of the midterm, that will be your asynchronous assignment for Thursday. So I will get like a midterm review handout posted sometime by the end of this week. And then you will at least know what are the big ticket items to focus on for the midterm. It will be heavily focused on what we have gone over this last couple of weeks in class. So from week 6 to next week, but it is cumulative in nature because it's a midterm. So it will also ask you some questions that refer back to the first 6 weeks of our class. So be aware of that as you're reviewing your material and whatnot. And then just kind of as a note on the asynchronous work, it seems like participation with that has sort of tapered off as we've progressed through the course. And just because there's not an expectation that you were, engaging with peers back and forth, whether or not you complete those online discussions and reflections is a part of your participation and attendance grade. So make sure that you're keeping up with that accordingly. And so after today we're going to talk about diversity of marriage. So different sort of cultural differences, and then some other concepts related to like marriage quality and things like that. But after today's content, there's a website posted that you can navigate on your own. I don't expect that you read every piece of the information on the website. I'll open it for you. Can you see this? It's a website that was developed by some folks at a university about marriage. And so it has a few people's like individual take on the concept of marriage. There's some interview data with married couples. And then they basically approach marriage through the biological, a personal, a societal, and also an anthropological lens. So looking at marriage across cultures. But if you'll just kind of peruse this website enough that you can think through your reflection to the discussion about what does marriage mean to you? Is it best interpreted through which one of those lenses? And I'm asking you here to make a Flipgrid video, 3 minutes. If you're not comfortable for whatever reason with the video piece, you can just record yourself without your face if necessary. But that is what is due for this week by the end of the week. Questions? Okay. If you'll give me just a second to get my life together. As I said, we're talking about diversity of marriage today. And so in addition to different types of marriage and cultural differences among marriages, we're going to look at the function of marriage. How does it serve us as individuals, as well as what's kind of the societal benefit? We'll talk about marriage not just as being a commitment to the partner, but also a commitment to other family members as well as the state, because it's a legal binding contract. I do want to take a few minutes to talk about weddings and honeymoons, kind of the ceremony and ritual there as a rite of passage in our society. And then we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about what happens to an individual and a couple in regards to changes after marriage. And as I mentioned at the beginning, what constitutes a successful marriage. So, individual motivations for marriage generally include love. Most people think that marriage is kind of the ultimate expression of love for another person. And most people expect fulfillment and positive outcomes from a married relationship. These positive outcomes might look like partnership, company, raising a family together. It has also been documented in the research that married couples report higher household incomes than unmarried individuals. About 80% of married women work outside the home to generate a second income that is then available to the couple. So there's an element of financial security or economic benefit to marriage as well. And so those are all kind of individual ideas or reasons why a person might want to be married. From a societal perspective, the societal function of marriage is that essentially it binds together two individuals who might likely raise children together, and then they will raise these children, socialize these children, and essentially leave replacements for themselves in the society. So there's kind of a, it's not necessarily evolutionary, but the reproductive nature of marriage relationships is a reason why the state and kind of the legal entities endorse the institution of marriage, because it benefits society in that generational way. It's pretty obvious that marriage is a commitment between two people. The partner and the relationship are, the obvious ways in which we are committing ourselves when we get married. And commitment to a partner and commitment to the marriage relationship is seen as the primary factor associated with what we call marital generosity. Marital generosity, you can think about the love languages that we talked about at the beginning of the course, and those ideas of like small acts of service, words of affirmation, forgiveness, affection, all of those things relate to this idea of marital generosity. And it's, kind of a cornerstone of a successful, healthy marriage is, that we see those acts being committed between the two partners. When we think about family to family commitment, married couples are often expected to, engage with their partner's family in new and sometimes in very extensive ways. So sharing holidays or, dividing holidays between one set of in-laws and the other, family vacations. Sometimes family members and extended kin become involved in marriage partnerships, childcare situations, sometimes helping, navigate interpersonal conflict, communication. All of that stuff can be where we see this family to family commitment happening. And then, as I've mentioned, the couple to state idea is that there's a state interest in marriage because of that societal function that marriage serves in basically establishing a mechanism for protection and care for children that come out of the marriage. So 3 concepts, conceptualizations of the marriage commitment. Marriage as a rite of passage. I think in our society, we see this, there's been a shift even in my lifetime in the way that weddings kind of happen. They're bigger and, more public, more expensive, but there are typically religious and civil components to a wedding. We often see people using traditional artifacts. There's that something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, where there's kind of a historical element, family history brought into the wedding ceremony. And as I said, they're often pricey and public in nature. Why do you think we've seen this shift from more of the kind of small, intimate family ceremonies to, weddings with 200 to 300 guests in really large venues? And what's happening there from your perspective?
I feel like some of it has something to do with capitalism and that everyone just kind of everyone has like, or a lot of people have a desire for more or slash bigger. So people have this idea that in order to be accepted as like a good couple, you have to have this like huge wedding with a lot of your family and friends, but that's definitely not true. That could honestly just be a kind of a cover for how things are going on underneath.
Yeah, lots of interesting points that you've made. So consumerism, capitalism, wedding is a business, it's an industry in our culture now. And so that's a big piece of it. And I think we have kind of all bought into, on some level, that competitive, I'm trying to keep up with the Joneses idea, where we want to look like we are presenting, a certain public image. And out of that comes this idea that the wedding itself, as a rite of passage, and the honeymoon, they're kind of intended to present the couple to the public as, no longer individuals, but this kind of partnership couple idea. And so that's why we kind of see the ceremony behind weddings, be them small or large. That was, kind of the intention, I think. But yeah, I think all of what was just mentioned are good rationale for why we've seen the changes that we've seen to these ceremonies. Does anyone else have ideas?
I feel like part of it's because like social media. So like a lot of people say that like weddings are just for pictures now because like you're gonna post them and all these people are there, but then like even more people online will see like, oh, like they had the best wedding ever, like it looks so cool.
Yes, the Pinterest wedding, I think everything is like that now. It's not just weddings, it's our child's first birthday and, going out on a Friday night. Like everything we do, it's filtered through this lens of what are we going to present to, the social media world, in a sense, which, we've talked a lot about media and technology in this class up to now, but I definitely think that's a component of the shift here. So as was mentioned, that this is not a requirement for a happy marriage. You do not have to spend mega bucks, or even, the formal ceremony. Really, you have to establish yourself legally in the eyes of the state if you want to be traditionally married, but that's basically the requirement. The rest of it is all sort of optional. And I think most important to consider is what works for you and your partner. When I was planning my own wedding, which has somehow been almost 10 years ago, I would sit down at the computer to look at like wedding venues and ideas and stuff. And I was just like, oh, nothing about this speaks to me. I did not want to do anything that I came across. And it was all so expensive. Even like a basic venue locally, it costs a lot of money. And so I called my sister and I was like, I just don't know. I don't want to do it like this. And she's like, why are you doing it like this then? And I think I felt pressure to adhere to like my mom's standards or, family members' ideas of what a wedding should look like. And she was like, dude, you're only, hopefully going to get married once. So you just need to do it the way you want to do it. And I called my mom and had sort of a follow-up conversation with her. And she said the same thing. So I was like, okay, sold. And my husband and I did like a wedding moon where we went to an island for 10 days. The first 3 days were dedicated to like pre-wedding stuff. We got married and then we spent a week there on our honeymoon. We had 2 people with us and we've been happily married ever since, mostly happily married ever since. But I highly recommend, whatever works for you, because the big deal wedding was just not something that I was invested in. Things change after you get married. On the most basic level, there are legal changes because, again, you've entered into partnership with another person in the eyes of the state. And so there are, financial implications, legal implications, and such regarding that. We also often see people changing their name, typically females taking on the last name of a partner. But I want to focus on sort of the mental and physical health changes and also social changes that we see as a result of marriage. So one consequence of marriage is the formation of a new identity. I kind of mentioned this when I said, like the purpose of the wedding ceremony itself is to present the couple to the public as a couple rather than 2 individuals. And that kind of has implications, I guess, for, how we view ourselves and our self-identity. We are no longer, living for ourselves, but we've committed to kind of living in partnership with another person. And so that might change how we think and how we behave. We also see that married partners consume less alcohol than their unmarried counterparts. So that's an interesting, probably shift in the right direction if we're talking about, health and mental wellness. But then the flip side of that is that we see married couples usually consuming more food, so less alcohol and more food. So weight gain and some physical changes might be related to marriage partnerships, which, all of this has risks and rewards, I guess. There is typically an increase in an individual's self-esteem and their sense of mastery when they get married. So if you refer back to those frameworks that we talked about at the very beginning of our class, the symbolic interaction framework says that how we interpret ourselves in the way that we see our partner viewing us, right? And so if we have a partner who is loving and accepting and, has a positive assessment of us as an individual, then that tends to improve how we view ourselves. So we see an increase in self-esteem as a result of, successful marriages, which we'll talk about what makes a marriage successful. Happy, healthy relationships. Marriage does affect other partnerships and other relationships. So we tend to see friendships change. We see partners in marriages spending less time with other people and more time together in the couple relationship. And in a certain way, this can be functional for your marriage, in that it strengthens the marriage. It gives you protected time with one another. But it can also be problematic because there can be this element of codependence that might come into the relationship. If we expect one person to meet all of our needs or to kind of be everything for us, to be our partner, to be our friend, to be our confidant, that's not necessarily healthy. So we do need to be mindful that other social relationships are still important, even though typically the tendency is to spend the bulk of your time with your married partner. And then marriage affects other family relationships. So as we're taking on new family members through in-laws and, other people that we become connected with, there's this kind of natural emotional separation from one's family of origin that, is part of the typical developmental trajectory of family life. So usually a positive shift, but again, something to navigate as a result of marriage. Other changes, this list kind of refers to things that either happen to the person, kind of the individual in the relationship, or things that the couple has to navigate themselves. So this first idea of loss of freedom is really related to the individual no longer doing kind of whatever they please, but it's more of a partnership. You know, you have to consider the other person, their needs, their wants, their interests, etc. We take on more responsibility for other people when we marry. So we're, you know, responsible for the needs of others. And sometimes this can be a source of resentment in the relationship, especially if we see the division of labor, you know, as inequitable. So if one partner is doing more of kind of the heavy lifting in terms of household responsibilities or work responsibilities, equity in the relationship is really important, or perception of equity. And if that's not there, then we see, you know, resentment and kind of conflict in the marriage. I've mentioned that we spend less time alone because we're pretty much spending all of our time with our partner if we're living together in the married relationship, right? And so you're waking up together, eating together, spending the majority of your leisure time together. And this obviously can have challenges that have to be navigated within the relationship. There are sexual changes after people get married. So initially we see sex behaviors kind of peaking in the first year of marriage, and then there's a steep drop off in sex behaviors after the second year of marriage, or beginning in the second year of marriage on. And so, you know, that's something just to kind of be aware of, that that's a typical pattern that most couples experience. However, it is important to note that married couples, in the research, married couples report higher levels of sexual satisfaction than their unmarried counterparts. So even though sex may not be happening as often as it does at the beginning of the marriage, it still tends to be a more satisfying sexual relationship once you're married. And then we see power changes. Power changes relates to this idea of kind of who's in charge. And it can be like in different domains of the relationship. So I'll give you the example of child rearing and financial management. We might see one partner sort of take the lead in terms of the child rearing expectations, and then another partner be more responsible for something like financial management. I think we have gender ideology ideas about which partner would do which one of those when I talk about those, you know. Typically we see women doing more of the childcare, child rearing, and men being more responsible for the financial piece. But in general, we see this sort of shift in power between the male and the female in a marriage relationship, where men tend to become less patriarchal and more collaborative after they get married, where women tend to defer less to the man's authority and to challenge the man's authority more often. So men are essentially giving up power while women are kind of rising in power within the married relationship. And so those shifts, you know, it's good to know about those and then to kind of think about how you're going to navigate those as a couple in partnership. And then number 6, the point on use of technology. As I said earlier, you know, we just live in a world where we have to consider the role of technology and kind of the consequences that technology use can have. And so I think partners today have to really consciously commit to how they're going to spend their free time with one another. You know, nothing drives me crazier than like when I'm talking to my husband and he's scrolling Instagram. I'm like, you are not even hearing the things coming out of my mouth. Super frustrating, you know? And so we have at times established like a put your phone to bed time where we both, you know, disconnect from our devices at 10 p.m. and then we have an hour of dedicated time to one another. whatever you need to do to work that out. But the main thing is to acknowledge and communicate about those type of issues, because if one person's over here with it and the other person's on a different wavelength, it can be a real source of conflict within the relationship. Can also be a space for extramarital connection. I have an acquaintance who, a friend of hers screenshotted her husband's Tinder profile, and that was kind of the end of their marriage. But those things do happen, and so I think being really transparent about how and why you're using social media and social networking is really important nowadays. Going to spend a couple minutes talking about cultural diversity as it relates to married relationships. And so first we'll talk about African American families and, the marriage experience for African American families, who make up about 13% of the US population. African American families have been stereotyped as being low income, having high birth rates among unmarried mothers, having absentee fathers, marital instability. These are all very negative stereotypes, clearly. And this view, the research suggests that these negative stereotypes really are born out of the tendency to look at Black families through the lens of white family norms. Instead of viewing Black families as having their own historical and sociocultural context, we're looking at them in comparison to white families in America. There is research suggesting that what is called the MEES, or the mundane extreme environmental stress theory, can be a way that we can examine the African American family experience in our culture. So mundane refers to common and chronic, daily. Extreme is the notion that it impacts the consciousness of the individual. Environmental, this is happening around the family or the person. Societal, and the outcome is stress. Mundane, extreme, environmental stress, and that contributes to some of these differences that we see in terms of Black versus white families. So these 3 points related to the history of oppression and evolved family structures. Typically, we see moms as the core of the family. We see women exhibiting a very strong and powerful role in Black families, and spiritual expression, spiritual connection is often a big, important component in African American families. And so these are empowering, egalitarian aspects of Black families that are often overlooked because of that tendency to view the negative stereotypes. This next slide just kind of outlines some traits or characteristics that are more common of African American families. And so, the general idea under numbers 1 and 2 are that Black families have a sense of pride and identification that they share, related to a shared history of group experiences and group struggles. I said that a key fixture in the African American family is the mother, and Black women characteristically engage in what we call community mothering, which is where they partner with other mothers in the rearing of children. Black families often employ firm discipline with their children. And the idea is kind of, it takes a village. They're working together to raise their children in sort of a community setting. Social justice training of children. Children in Black families are socialized towards culturally entrenched racism, so that as they grow and become more independent in society, they're prepared with how they're going to navigate these circumstances when they are faced with them. And then I already mentioned religion is being a cornerstone of African American marriages. These ties to religion are usually rooted in a shared history at a time when church provided connection and coping in the face of the oppression of slavery. And then divorce and extended family, we do see that economic oppression and societal, entrenchment of racism contribute to higher divorce rates among Blacks as compared to white families. And so extended family living, childcare, interfamilial support, those are all ideas that kind of relate to the African-American family structure and family experience. Hispanic and Latino American families, about 18% of the US population. And the term Hispanic or Latino here can be used to refer to either immigrants coming to the country or US born natives with an ancestry to a Spanish speaking country. Typically, we see Latino families having higher rates of marriage at younger ages. They also have higher fertility rates, having more children. And then the three micro family factors, we do see this sort of patriarchal dynamic in their family relationships where males are sort of the power figure. But at the same time, their families are very mother-centric. So a mother's involvement with her children is a strong influence on the marriage and family interactions. And then strong familial values. This relates specifically to respect for the elderly, as well as valuing the home language. A lot of times Hispanic and Latino families are only Spanish speaking in the home as a way to kind of stay connected to their history. And finally, Asian American families. Asian American family structures often include extended family members, so generational living, and sometimes friends can be very important social supports for Asian American families. A difference in Asian American families as compared to other families in US culture is that the parent-child relationship is often considered to be more important than the couple relationship. So we see a really heavy focus on parenthood and the parent-child relationship here. And then similar to what I just talked about with Hispanic families, filial piety is this idea of being respectful to and caretaking for elderly family members is a strong family value in Asian American families also. Another specific type of family that I will mention in terms of diversity is polyamorous families. So if you remember, polyamory refers to multiple loves. And so these are families with more than one husband or wife. And there are clear benefits and challenges to this type of family structure. The benefits include shared resources, specifically shared income or increased personal time and attention for children in the family. There are more hands on deck, if you will. Emotional intimacy and honesty. So a lot of times parents in polyamorous families emphasize honesty with their children and partners as a kind of key element of their relationship philosophy. And they view honesty as a way to create emotional intimacy within the family among all the partners. And then there's also this idea that multiple role models emerge for children from polyfamilies. So children's lives are thought to be enriched by the experiences of having multiple loving adults in their home. The flip side of that is that there is a lot of social stigma still around polyamory, and so that can create its own challenges for folks to navigate. And then the text brings out this idea that teenagers from polyamorous families sometimes use the family structure, the family dynamic as a means of holding leverage over their parents. So this lifestyle is often led kind of behind closed doors or in secret. And so once teenagers, are in a position to kind of lord it over their parents' head that they're living this way, they might choose to do that. So that's a difficulty that they have to navigate. And then the final type of family, if you will, that we'll discuss is military families. Military families are unique in a variety of ways, typically related to deployment and having one partner pulled away from the home for sometimes unexpected and undetermined amounts of time. And so that tends to be men that are deployed, which leaves women, at home to kind of hold down the fort, to care for the house and the children. So that idea of traditional sex or gender roles is something that we see as being kind of characteristic of military families. Loss of control, loss of sense of control related to deployment. So as I said, deployment itself creates this element of uncertainty in the relationship where people are not sure when to expect a partner to be pulled away from the home. And that can be a real challenge in and of itself. The idea of infidelity is listed here because deployment, being away from the home and the partner for those extended periods of time, it does increase the couple's vulnerability to infidelity in the relationship. And so again, awareness of this is kind of the first step in managing it, and making sure that you've got, open and clear lines of communication around these issues. Because of separation from extended family, most of the time we see military families moving around a lot, traveling to different places, living in different places. The need for a real support system, social support system outside of family members becomes really important for military families. So we often see them drawing on the military community, other people living in similar circumstances, to offer that support that other couples might get from their families of origin, etc. Typically speaking, deployment can contribute to lower marital satisfaction. Lower marital satisfaction is a characteristic of military families that has been reported in the research. This could also be related to individual issues as a result of military activity, like traumatic experiences, PTSD, those type of things that can impact a person and in turn kind of impact the partnership. And then despite all of these challenges that I've mentioned, there are elements of, positive elements to military families. So they have a consistency of work. They know that they're going to have a job. They have medical benefits, sometimes financial benefits that can support these families in unique ways to kind of offset the unique challenges that they face. And so the idea of resiliency is something that's sort of characteristic of military families also. The next couple of slides really just go through the idea of marriage quality. So what contributes to marital success? How do we determine what is a successful relationship? Typically, relationship quality is measured in terms of stability and happiness. And the research around this often asks, just a second. Sorry about that. Research around marital success often asks partners, spouses, questions like, how do you spend your free time together? How often do you engage in conflict around various issues? How often do you agree? How do you resolve conflicts? And then sexual satisfaction and feelings of equity within the marriage. And so this list about, you know, quality time together, communication, there's kind of a religious and spiritual element, trust, personal and emotional commitment, sexual satisfaction, equity in relationships, security related to finances, physical and emotional health, empathy, realistic expectations. I think that's really a big one. You know, are we being realistic in terms of what we expect out of the relationship? And then the last one on the list is interesting. There is a gene that has been documented as being related to empathy and attachment. And people who have this gene, possess this gene, tend to report happier and more stable marriages. And finally, there was a longitudinal study that was trying to assess marital happiness across time. And they looked at couples over the course of 20 years together and basically developed these 5 patterns of marital happiness. So there were 2 levels of what they call high stable, and these are the happiest couples. High stable 2, they're very happy, and that is consistent across the marriage relationship. High stable 1s were slightly less happy, so kind of like a level down in terms of happiness, but also consistent and stable across time. Curvilinear relationships are interesting because they start out happy. There's sometimes a decline in their marital happiness or marital success, but then recovery from that. So they become happy as a couple again. And obviously the first 3 on this list are going to have more positive outcomes than numbers 4 and 5, which were not very happy to begin with and either stayed consistent across time in terms of not very happy, or they were not very happy to begin with and they got less happy over time. You know, the relationship was deteriorating. And so again, I think, you know, as with anything, kind of understanding this, that, you know, these are the typical patterns of marriage relationships can help us navigate, especially if we find ourselves maybe like in that curvilinear situation where we're happy initially and then we're not happy. What are the steps we can take to kind of recover from that? And if you start out married and you're not happy, you know, that's definitely a place for pause and assessment of the decision, right? And that is all we have for today. So unless anyone has specific questions related to reflections or the midterm, if you will type your name into the chat really quickly. And then there's a question in the chat about marriage. Do partners tend to spend more time with married couples or still hang out with their single friends? From my own personal experience, it has been the married couples. You know, you tend to kind of, and then once you have children, I think that shifts again. You spend more time with people who have children because they're on the same schedule as you, you know, but we tend to kind of associate, it's that idea of homogeny in terms of partner selection that we talked about last week. We tend to do that, I think, in our social relationships with friends as well. And so, you know, generally speaking, people who are single are like going out more, living a different lifestyle than married couples. And so I think there's kind of a natural shift towards spending more time with people who are living the same lifestyle, generally speaking, as you are in those different points of life. That's just been my experience. Any other questions or ideas on any of this? Alex?
Yeah, I think like one question in regards to like cohabit oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like cohabitation, in terms of like with the whole marriage process and like weddings and everything. Is it more common with like people who share that kind of relationship to like not go out and go more expensive because like of the situation they're in, or like not the situation they're in, but like of the choice of partnership that they chose with like cohabitating together? Like, is there more of a um like observation towards like small weddings or like small gatherings, or is there like more of like a bigger wedding because of like the amount of resources that they've gathered together? Like, is there any sort of like dynamic between that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I know like specifically from the research. I think anecdotally, I can probably say that what I have observed from my own social group, and myself included, is that couples who cohabitate, you've kind of already established yourself. You know, if you've lived with someone for a couple of years before you marry them, you've kind of already done that thing where you've established yourself as a partnership, a couple, to the public, because people, you know, people recognize you as a couple. So I think the tendency, just from my own experience, is to do less of the big deal wedding when you've already been living together. Although the financial piece that you bring in is interesting, because, you know, theoretically speaking, there would be more resources available to the couple who are already sharing rent and in some ways sharing finances. But I think what I've seen is a tendency more for people who are still living individually to do those bigger deal type of weddings as a way to kind of present themselves to the public as a couple.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Yep. Anybody else? All right, I'll hang around for a few minutes to chat with anybody who might need me. Otherwise, you are free to go enjoy the warmer air and the sun and the 22222. I think I added an extra 2 in there, but it's 22222 today. So if you didn't know, now you know. Y'all take care. Have a good week. Desi?
I just had a question. So how is the midterm exam going to be